In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. And so begins one of the most epic narrative universes of certainly the last century, possibly of all time. I'm talking, of course, about the Lord of the Rings story universe. That's what we're talking about today on the Think Podcast. Welcome to the Think Podcast with Joel Settecase. My name is Joel Settecase, and this is the show that tackles impossible questions from a biblical perspective to help you explain, share, and defend the Christian message. Now, The Lord of the Rings is a timeless work. It's an absolutely classic body of literature that will be remembered and cherished for generations to come. But is it a Christian story? Can we learn anything about the gospel by reading it? And just what does it mean for a story to be Christian anyway? Well, my guest today is Michael Jahosky. Michael is assistant professor of humanities at St. Petersburg College in Clearwater, Florida. Michael, a Roman Catholic, also teaches apologetics classes in a local Protestant church and is involved in campus ministry. Michael's academic background is in classical, that's Greco-Roman, Greek and Roman, as well as biblical history, as well as, get this, philosophy, theology, and the arts. Talk about some bona fides. He earned his 2 bachelor degrees, that's 2, from the University of Central Florida and holds a master's from the University of South Florida. Michael routinely includes the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis in his humanities classes. He's the author of the brand new book, The Good News of the Return of the King, The Gospel in Middle Earth, and he joins me today to help us answer the question, just how Christian is the Lord of the Rings? So without any further ado, Michael, welcome to the Think Podcast.
That was a heck of an intro. Thank you, Joel, for having me. I'm thrilled to be on.
Well, it's my pleasure, man. You know what? I actually downloaded a couple of new backgrounds for our show today. So if you're watching live, look at this. We've got, you can't really see that, but I'm going to take us out of the picture so people can see. This is a picture of the Shire here. Just a second.
Mm-hmm. Good stuff.
There we go. Okay, we're back. And so we've got some various Lord of the Rings themed backgrounds for our viewing audience. If you are watching live on Facebook and YouTube, go ahead and drop a comment below. And Mr. Jahosky, I always want to say Jahosky. I don't know. Do you ever get that?
No, I get all sorts of exotic spellings and pronunciations. Everybody likes to add a C or a Z in there, and my students, they really have been creative, but no, you nailed it. It's Jahosky.
Jahosky. Okay, good.
Yeah.
So Michael's going to be sharing, going to be answering some questions for us at the end. I don't know, Michael, you okay to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. And if there's any point, in the middle, if it's pertinent, we can stop. If it's your show. So if you want me to answer them at any point, I'm happy to do so.
Perfect. Well, we've already gotten some questions coming in. Before we get into the meat, let me go ahead and let's pitch your book here, because I'm telling you, people are going to want to get this book after this episode. They're probably going to want to get it while we're talking. So I'm going to go ahead. I put the web address there where you can get 40% off of Michael Jahosky's book, The Good News of the Return of the King. You can go to tinyurl.com/Jahosky book. That's Jahosky book. And then if you use the code CONF2020, you can get 40% off. And that'll link you right to Michael Heiser's podcast page. So that's how you know you've hit the big time, when you're on Michael Heiser's podcast page.
I nerded out on it a little bit. I tried to contain it, but I couldn't help it. So.
Well, I know that you're, I don't think it'd be inappropriate to say you're a fan of Michael Heiser. Is that fair?
No, definitely. Don't agree with everything, but yes, I'm a fan of his work. Yep.
Yeah. You always got to put that disclaimer in there, right?
Yeah, of course. I know, don't we? Yeah.
Yes. So here's your blog. So if you want to check out Michael Jahosky's blog as well, you can go ahead and go to, let's see, it is last Dunadan.com .wordpress.com. Am I pronouncing that right?
You are. Yeah, it's one of the monikers for Aragorn. So some of the nerds out there will get it.
Got it. Okay, good. All right, all you nerds, go check that out. And literature fans, fans of Tolkien. And then if you just want to get into Tolkien a little bit, this looks like a great place to start. So it's the author blog of Michael Jahosky. So go check that out. Right after this show, you're going to want to take a look at that. Michael, would you just, I mean, look, all I had to do was post the question on Facebook: is Lord of the Rings a Christian story? And I got a small taste of what you must be going through on a daily basis.
Oh yeah.
Because it was fireworks, man. It was more fireworks than Gandalf created during his entrance into the Shire.
That's right.
It was pretty amazing how many people no, it can't be Christian because of this reason, or it can't be Christian because of this completely different reason, or of course it's Christian, and for this reason or that reason. So look, that's kind of the big question that we're going to dig into today. Is the Lord of the Rings a Christian story?
Yeah, it is. But in true parabolic fashion, we'll learn about parables today. It's a yes and no answer. And that's how it should be. It's paradoxical, like the incarnation himself, and defies, complete comprehensive understanding. Only God has that kind of understanding, and he's fit to reveal that to us. So I think the reason why we see people polarizing over it is because there's truth on both sides. And like any good paradox, and the Hebraic background of the Bible, the Jewish worldview has always been comfortable with paradox, or some call it antinomy, not the same as contradiction. I think it is kind of a yes and no, and finding out exactly how it is. Yes, it is a Christian story. And then no, the no part is still part of the yes part, if that makes any sense. It's complicated, and we should let it and allow it to be complicated. And I think it has to do with the form that the book takes, but we'll get into that.
The analytic philosopher in me right now is screaming because you said the no part is also part of the yes part.
I know. There's no better way I can fit to explain it.
It's good. So let's go ahead and dive in a little bit. Thank you for that introduction.
Sure.
So Michael Jahosky, what is behind your passion for this literary world of J.R.R. Tolkien? And is it Tolkien or Tolkien?
I think it's Tolkien, but I slip and say it either way, just in the midst of talking. So Tolkien is usually how it kind of comes out in the slur of speech. But he even has a letter where I think he tried to correct the pronunciation, and somebody had written him about the Germanness of it. And anyway, he's even got a pronunciation guide in his letter. So Tolkien is close to my heart because I rediscovered Christ and discovered Tolkien at the same time. And just a little bit of backstory on that in a second. But to answer your question, my passion really has to do with just stories. I came to understand that Jesus primarily spoke in stories only after reading Tolkien. And you might say, well, come on, that's a duh, that's a no-brainer. But it took kind of going the indirect route for me to understand that. And so it's really my love of stories. And it's been my apologetic and little ministry that I do, even in my classroom and outside it, that I've learned that stories sometimes say best what needs to be said. And I'm quoting C.S. Lewis there, who has a great little essay called "Sometimes Fairy Stories Say Best What Needs to Be Said." And so I've learned that the way of inhabiting Jesus's sacramental vision of the universe, of reality, the only one that we live in, is best understood through story. And so it's really that passion, but it's my passion for Jesus. It's my passion to invite people into the story world that Jesus has created, and to say, well, what if this is true, and to get them to consider that, and to help make them disciples, right? And I think, again, one of those authors you read, you agree and you disagree, but Scott McKnight had put it, the church sometimes is so interested in making converts that we forget how to make disciples. And I see that you're really good at doing that. You've got some really great things. That Hammer and Anvil, by the way, looks awesome. I'm interested in that. So, we need to be interested in making disciples out of people, not just converts. And it's important to confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord, and in our heart believe that. But we need to get people to understand the process of belief can sometimes be very long. Stories help us to do that. And so it's it comes back to my passion for stories. And I can say more about my background now, or we can, say it later. I don't know.
Dive in, man. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Briefly share us a little bit more of your background and your backstory.
Sure. Joel thank you. You did an excellent introduction. And I think it's best to kind of leave it as he said it. I'm a bit of a walking contradiction, maybe to some, but it's because I'm still praying and searching for a church home for my family. I was raised, baptized, and received First Communion as a Roman Catholic in the 90s as a kid. I'm dating myself. And we drifted away from the church. My parents got divorced. My mom rediscovered kind of a baby Christianity. What we later found out was prosperity gospel. Joyce Meyer was on every day. A lot of Christians can probably relate to this. And this was about 2001. We didn't go back to Catholicism. Nobody in my family really did. And that's kind of what started my quest for this book. I didn't know it at the time. So I was just kind of there as a Christian. I didn't know what it meant. And through all the years of high school and undergrad and even into graduate school, it really wasn't until I read N.T. Wright, who it just so happens, I didn't plan this, obviously. I read his book, Simply Jesus, I think the year it came out, 2011, I think 10 or 11, which is right when I started teaching as a professor of humanities. And, I just started thinking about so many things, but I'm like, his description of the gospel sounds like something I had heard before. Sounds like the Lord of the Rings. And I'm like, well, that can't be right. That doesn't make any sense. And then it began to make sense. And then from 2010 to the present, let's say, which is the last decade, I have, starting in 2013, been teaching at a Presbyterian church, but at actually 2 points, I think in 2015, and then again just this past summer when I was finishing the book. And for those of you that do buy the book, you'll read in the preface and introduction that I decided to return to the Catholic Church. I still, in my heart, there are parts of me that want to, and my wife too, but we're still praying on it. And so we are kind of in the middle of things, and we're no longer active at that church for reasons I don't want to state here, but a conversation for another time. But we are trying to find a home. And so I am trying to be ecumenical in this book as best I can, but I have a unique perspective, I think, to bring to the table.
Yeah, no, that's cool. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. I got to tell you, man, the more I have found out about your backstory, the more intrigued I've been because, okay, so here's this guy's a Roman Catholic, and he's teaching apologetics classes at a Presbyterian church, and there's got to be a good story there. So but I've appreciated getting to learn that in bits and pieces. I kind of feel like I'm reading the Lord of the Rings a little bit, how the different details come in and that I think that's one of the things that make Lord of the Rings so realistic is the way the details all fit together. And so I'm very much looking forward to unpacking that with you. How did you know that it was time to write this book?
Yeah, I thought long and hard about a fancy answer to this, but I'll just be blunt. I was fed up with the books I was reading, and in a good way. I was just, I was reading so many Tolkien studies books, some that were biblical scholars and some that were not. And since we already did the shout out to Mike Heiser, on his podcast, we got into this, and I think he said something like this. He said, I think what many of these scholars needed was a good shot in the arm of biblical theology. And I was just dissatisfied with a lot of the books on the subject. I mean, I remember, I won't name names, but I can always provide them. But it's not a personal thing, of course. It's the academics I had an issue with. So, for example, James Stuart Bell, I think, I don't know him very well, but had a book about the spirituality of the Hobbit. But I felt like he got so close to pointing out, why is it at various points do the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit of the Silmarillion and all of them seem like Christian stories and then not seem like Christian stories? And I felt like the answer was right there, and then he took it away. And so there was that experience. And then I said, I got to write this book because I've got to figure out why I'm journaling during Advent, way back in 2015 and 2014, even when the movies were coming out, the Hobbit movies. And I'm trying to just get out on paper. Why do these movies, why did these books all these years affect me so much? I'm like, I got to write a book about this. I've got to make sense of it for myself. So that's really the answer. But it's also because I felt like we could do better. And the more I dug into allegory, metaphor, parable, the more I understood that not only is there not a great amount of agreement here, there's not a consensus, but there are some very good arguments that I present here in this book that I think will satisfy people who have struggled to articulate this. So that's why I wrote it.
No, I can see that. I got to say, I've been looking forward to this conversation because prior to reading your book, and I did finish it yesterday.
Thank you.
I was unconvinced. Actually, I'll say this. I was very much leaning toward Lord of the Rings not officially being a Christian story.
Sure.
A lot of that has to do with an article I'm going to bring up to you later, which is very, very much on the popular level, but it's a website a lot of people go to.
I've seen it. Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
We'll take a look at it.
So I was leaning in that direction. After reading your book, I'm leaning in the other direction, but I want to get a few things straight. I want to clarify a few things.
Certainly.
Why, Michael, why is this question important for, it's just a book, right? It's, there's lots of books out there. There's Harry Potter. There's The Handmaid's Tale, which is like, all anybody can talk about nowadays. But why is it important to talk about Lord of the Rings? Why is it important to understand whether this is a Christian story?
I want to answer this question, but I want to point out, like with the Witcher books, which I enjoy even just for research, and I enjoy them just as stories themselves, but they're dark, very existentialist, postmodernist kind of mixture of worldviews. A lot of people don't make an issue when we say those worldviews are at play in those books. I haven't seen anybody make a fuss about it, but we make a huge fuss when we say that Christianity is at the heart of Lord of the Rings. And I think you and I know why that is. I think it's because maybe, and this might be brazen to some, but I think it's because maybe we sense, what if it's true? And if it's true, and this is a powerful delivery of that story, that's making me uncomfortable.
Wow.
So, I think that's part of it. I want to get more into Peter Kreeft, who was a Protestant turned Catholic scholar who has written about this too, but we'll get to that in some of your questions later. So back to the point. I think Mark 4:34 gives us an answer because he said everything to them in parables. And when he spoke to them, everything in parables. Jesus spoke primarily in parables. And again in my bibliography, I can point out books where several of these great biblical scholars and Tolkien scholars have pointed out this is something we need to make central to our theology. Jesus is telling us, among many other things, that there's something important about the process of coming to understand who he is and what the gospel is all about and how those things are related. And in just the process of coming to belief. You think of the man in the Gospels who I think it was his daughter was sick. I might be getting this mixed up, but he says, help me with my unbelief, which is just every believer's cry. We need to kind of understand that this was also important to Tolkien. He wanted to write a story that was not a violation of what one of his friends calls the art of the parable, but that was still a Christian story. And I think it's because he understood that stories were important to Jesus. And so they must be to all Christians. What else I can say here, and I'm just looking at some notes I prepared. There's some things we can say later. Tolkien's letters, I think that's where we should stop with this. Is it's important because it was important to him, and it was important to him as a Christian more broadly and a Catholic more specifically. And so I think that should raise some flags, and that one of his Jesuit friends from the 1940s onward and into the 1990s, he finally produced a sermon and an essay in Tolkien's honor called Tolkien and the Art of the Parable. And he kind of latched on to this. That should tell us something. And so I think it's important to understand.
Okay. Yeah. That's that reference you made was Mark 9:24. It was a boy's father who the boy had an evil spirit, and the father cried out to him. And I love that verse. I've preached on that verse when I was a pastor. It's very powerful. It expresses a lot of the Christian story. And I think that I appreciate how you articulated that, why this is important for us to understand. And there's this word you keep using, parable. And we're going to get into that. So if you're watching from home right now or in your car or whatever, hopefully you have the video turned off. As handsome as Michael and I are, you want to turn off the video while you're driving.
Please. Please.
We are going to unpack this idea of parable. And this, I will say, this idea of Tolkien being Roman Catholic, this has got to come up as well. It's an elephant in the room for a lot of these discussions when we're talking about, is a story Christian or not? And someone goes, yeah, of course it's Catholic. There's a lot of people who are going to go, exactly my point. And there's going to be people on both sides who are going to say, exactly my point. That's why it is, or that's why it isn't. But before we dive into that, Michael, briefly, and we're going to unpack this, but what is the good news of the Return of the King?
So I think it's the story of a long known prophesied exiled king who's living in exile, who comes back and brings the good news that everything is going to be okay, and that things might not start to look that way right away, but they will slowly start to get better, and that we have to live in between that moment of announcement and the moment of its final consummation. Christians who are listening know that this is the already and not yet aspect I discuss in chapter 2 of my book,
Right.
that has been well pointed out by Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox people, Christians, on all sides of the church. And I think that's the good news. In a nutshell, the good news is that Jesus saves us from our sins. And I know that there will be some concerns that there's no salvific figure, or at least you think, in the Lord of the Rings. And I want to address that right now. No, there's not. There doesn't have to be for it to be about a salvific king. It gestures away from it, just in the way that Jesus's parables don't save. Jesus saves, but Jesus spoke in parables, indirect speech, to get us to look at that reality. So I think if we can keep that distinction in mind, we don't need to expect a dying and rising Messiah. Although, as you'll hear me say, there are some points in the story where you might think maybe it is in there, and maybe it's not. So I think that's important. I think that's what the good news of the Return of the King is. It's good news that, and Peter Kreeft says in his book, The Philosophy of Tolkien, we don't have kings in America. We don't have them, but we want them. And there's something in our subconscious, he says, like an Arthur sitting on a throne, that yearns to return to our conscious minds. We want this. What is it about this story? I've heard Tim Keller preach on this, and I've been praying for him. I know he's going through treatment for cancer right now, but he's been a formative influence in my life, and he's written about this. This is, so there's something about the type, the biblical type of the king, and just this universal type that affects us. And we'll get into that. But yeah, I think that's succinctly what it is. That's the good news of the Return of the King.
Okay. All right. Well, that's helpful. A lot to chew on there and a lot for us to unpack. But before we do, I got to know, man, what's better, the movies or the book?
The books. Yeah.
Books.
However,
no question.
No question. However, there's some really nice treats in there for, like, the last Hobbit film, The Battle of the Five Armies, I think was 2014. No. Is that right? Yeah, 2014.
That could be right.
There was 2012, 2013, 2014. Somebody will point it out in the comments, but in it, there's a moment, and I talk about this in my book in chapter 3 or 4, where Gandalf sees Thorin charging into battle, and that scene is so much better in the books, but they didn't do half bad. And Bilbo says something like, "What are they doing?" And Gandalf, with a glint in his eye, says they're rallying to their king. And if you don't get goosebumps with that, with the music and the image, and think of Jesus, or even the Old Testament kings, Josiah riding out to battle between the Assyrians and the Egyptians, even, you think of all these things. And there's little Easter eggs like that make the movie splendid and nice, but they're kind of a mess in some other areas. So let's not, I don't want to get red in the face and get into that. So I'll just calm down and put that to the side. Yeah.
That's fair enough. That's fair enough. Several, like, let's say about 3 months ago, my wife and I wanted to start going through a daily Bible reading with the kids. And we've read through a few of the New Testament books. I think we've gone through all the Gospels with them over the last few years. But we wanted to turn to the Old Testament. And so we started, I'll cut to the chase. We started with Joshua. And we've read now through Joshua, one section at a time: Joshua, Judges, Ruth, First Kings, Second Kings. First Samuel, Second Samuel. We're in First Kings, I believe. No. We skipped ahead. We're in Matthew now because it's Christmas. But the reason we started with Joshua, Michael, is because my thinking was this: what section of the Bible is most Narnia or Lord of the Rings-esque? Who's going to have the battles? Who's going to have the grandeur? And I tell you, the amazing thing, as you read through the history of Israel, and you read the story of David, who's the warlord in exile and, running from Saul, and then he rises to the throne, and there's all these moral battles and whatnot. Now, Jesus is not mentioned in any of those stories. And those stories are not parabolic. They are historical, but Jesus is all over those stories.
All over it.
The king in exile who returns and takes the throne. And after reading your book, those themes absolutely just jump from the pages of Scripture.
Good.
So very, very cool.
Yes, they should. Thank you. Yeah, and you know what? It's because they're prefigurations, not predictions. And Richard Hayes has that great, and you know about this with your background. Richard Hayes has a book called Echoes of the Scripture in the Gospels, and he talks about the necessity for, and I talk about it in my book, the retrospective hermeneutic of interpreting Scripture from the position of the risen Jesus in Luke 24 on the Emmaus Road, looking back from the risen Jesus. And he tells us to search Moses and the prophets and the writings to find him there. He doesn't tell us how to do it, which is intriguing, but he tells us to expect exactly what you just described. These prefigurations that only really make sense once you know about that second event, the risen Messiah. So that's powerful. Yeah,
that's really good. I've got this apologetic argument, which I think is original. I don't know of anybody else who has something similar, but it's basically an argument from foreshadowing. And awesome. I talk about how if you don't recognize the foreshadowing, not direct predictions, if you don't recognize the foreshadowing in the Old Testament that foreshadows the gospel and foreshadows Christ, then categorically you can't recognize. You basically have to do away with foreshadowing as a literary concept because it's so obviously there. And the only way you can have foreshadowing is if there's one author overseeing the story. Yes. Moses can't foreshadow something that happened 1,500 years after his death.
No.
But foreshadowing is possible if you've got a Tolkien or if you've got a divine author writing scripture.
Yes.
You can foreshadow themes. So there's a lot of that. Could you give us, for those who are maybe newbies when it comes to the world of Tolkien and Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, can you just give us like an elevator pitch for what is the story about? What is this world about?
Well, I think it's the most succinct elevator pitch I could give you, and I'll elaborate a little bit, is in the one of the last chapters of The Return of the King, the third part of The Lord of the Rings. And Bilbo has left some titles on his journal, the Red Book of Westmarch, and Frodo has seen that he's gone through several. And then he adds the downfall of Sauron and the Return of the King. That's the title of their journeys from The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And this is in the universe, right? So he gives that title to the events inside the universe. So it's a cool conceit.
Yeah.
And I think that's it right there. I mean, that's what the story is about. Now, that's what The Lord of the Rings is about. The downfall of Sauron, a manifestation of evil, not the, and not the only one in Middle-earth, or Arda as the world is called, and the Return of the King. And that's what's in Tolkien's letters too, which I'll get into. But more than that, I would say, look, the Silmarillion is a lot of things. There's, he worked on it his whole life throughout the 20th century. It is, I'm not reducing it to just this, but elevator pitch, it's the creation myth. It's the primeval history. It's the patriarch-esque stuff. I'm speaking parabolically here. I don't mean it one for one. But it has a little of that. And of course it's unique in its own right. The Hobbit is more of the same. I liken the Silmarillion and the Hobbit. No, are they exactly like the Old Testament? Of course not. Are they on the same level? You got to be kidding. I'm not saying that. Right. But they're like an imaginative version of that scriptural experience. So they're kind of like the Old Testament, if you will. And Tolkien, in the letter, he says part of the attraction of the appeal of the Lord of the Rings, I think, is what he says, is the glimpses in the Lord of the Rings book to these other books. And so he again kind of says, look back, almost like exactly what Jesus says to do. And so that's what it is. And you have the themes are very clear: creation, fall, and they're very similar to what we have in the Bible, if not almost crystal clear. Creation, fall, redemption, restoration, however you want to divide up the meta narrative, but that's what it is for me. And it's in there. And then there's an unfinished sequel we'll get into, but that's it. I think that's a good summary. There's so much more to say.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And let's talk about that. Let's talk about, okay. You know what? Really quickly, because there are some watching, and I would imagine with our audience, it's a fairly literate audience.
Yeah.
That being said, I would imagine that there's some who are still more outsiders to this whole world. Can you explain just briefly what has made the Lord of the Rings story, and I'm speaking about all the stories combined, viewed as one universe, what has made this so popular? Why has it endured so stinking well, to the fact that they keep making new versions of it? Netflix, I guess, or whoever's got this new version
Amazon.
coming out. Amazon, right, which is probably going to be terrible.
Yeah,
from what
and
I've heard.
Narnia is going to Netflix, I think. So I'm like
Okay.
you probably. I'm a little skeptical, but yeah,
Sure.
we'll
You,
see.
you
We'll
got,
see.
you got, well, part of that skepticism comes from the fact that you've got pagans making what essentially a Christian story.
Yep,
As much
yep.
as we might debate it, Tolkien was
Mhm.
some brand of Christian. The story
Yeah.
is some brand of Christian. And now
Yep.
you've got people with a very different worldview.
I know.
What's
I hope
made
they
this?
have. Yeah.
Sorry, please. No, go ahead.
No. So your question, what's made it so appealing is hard to answer, but I'll offer what I say in the book, and I think it's because people want it to be real, because it is real. It feels real, and the best thing I can do is stand on the shoulders of great scholars that I owe a great debt to in this book, that I've paid homage to, and I just want to say thank you, especially to Peter Kreeft. He's really changed my life in the way he wrote about this, because he kind of pointed it out for me first in many ways that Wright didn't. He did the kind of scholarly side of things. But Kreeft, he says it feels like reality. It bears endless rereadings. You can pour into it and bore into it again and again. And you can do that with Jesus's parables. Now, am I saying that that's what makes The Lord of the Rings a parabolic novel, as one scholar has called it? Not necessarily, but it doesn't not make it. It does kind of almost start to build a case that just the fact that you can go back and you can read Jesus's parables and not be familiar with the settings and yet still be transformed by them, and do the same thing with The Lord of the Rings. This is what Tolkien was going for, I believe, not consciously, unconsciously, as he says in the revision. He understood that he had poured his Christian vision into this. And so, I think it's because it feels realistic. And I make a case for that philosophically in the book.
Yeah, and actually on Facebook earlier today, you said, this is a quote from a thread that we were both participating in. You said, "This is a really contentious topic, but I think I've really opened up new conversations about allegory, and I'm very confident in the direction I've taken this." Michael, what is that new conversation? What is that new direction?
Again, I've picked up pieces that other scholars have stated but left unexplained, and my book kind of fills the gap. I've taken several good starts to arguments about this, and I feel that my work of scholarship, as I intended to be, is trying to plug that gap using those arguments and to finish it out. And I think what it is that, yes, The Lord of the Rings is an allegory. It's just not the one you think it is. There are different kinds of allegory, and I can just invite you to look at the endnotes and read the book, and you'll see I have several letters where Tolkien is all over the place in talking about it. But in letter 181, in the edited letters by Humphrey Carpenter, and letter 131, letter 142, I could think letter 89, there are several off the top of my head where he speaks of one parable versus another. In one, I can't remember the letter precisely, but he says, of course, The Lord of the Rings is not an allegory of atomic power. The stupid World War II things that people were saying, letters from Americans, but it is an allegory about power and domination. And so he says it's not that kind of allegory. And then one of your friends on Facebook had posted something about there is no allegorical meaning or topic that it's about. And yeah, that's true. It's not that kind of allegory. And so, but it's a different kind of allegory. And so my research has shown me that there is a typology or a classification, genus of allegories, if you will. And every scholar I've read has said, look, it's not, at the end of the day, it's not important what we call these stories, but how they function and what they do to us that matters. But what we could make the case for, and every scholar has their own way of doing this, is that there's a spectrum of allegories, and that one lie on the far end of one end of the spectrum is the one Tolkien cordially disliked. He called the conscious and intentional allegory.
The real simplistic, one for one. Yeah. This is that.
And it is absolutely and abundantly clear. There's no question. Think of John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, or even parts of Milton or Dante and several others that have those clear connections, and even some sections of the Narnia. And there's no doubt the Pevensey children are called the sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve. I don't think that makes all of Lewis allegorical. That's another story. So yeah, but then on the other end of the spectrum, there is the fairy story, which one of his friends connected to the New Testament parable. And then I've furthered that research. Now, the fairy story is another type of allegory. And if it's analogous, or at least very close to a parable, what we can just simplify all this by saying is this: there's a spectrum of allegory, conscious and intentional is on one end, parables on the other, the end. And then the details will follow later. We'll talk about it, I'm sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's so that's helpful. And it's a good start. And obviously, you argue that this is a Christian story.
Yes.
It is very different from A Pilgrim's Progress. Pilgrim's Progress is a cherished story. It reminds and typifies a lot of what we experience on our Christian journey, but the meaning is right there at the surface. Yes. But Tolkien's works are also even different from like a Chronicles of Narnia. And I think this is where a lot of, if Narnia hadn't been written, I wonder if Tolkien would have taken so much, as much flack as he has, because in Narnia, you've got Aslan. Aslan is Jesus. There's, and I know, he's not exactly Jesus. And it's, what's the word? You talked about it with my brother on his, a supposal. It's a supposal.
Yeah. Yes.
What if there was this other, suppose there was another world and there was another savior there who, what would Jesus be like in this other world? Exactly. But when it comes to Lord of the Rings, the story realm of Lord of the Rings seems to be lacking many of the elements that we might expect in a Christian allegory of any kind. And even dare I say, even a parabolic story. Yeah. Like look, in the parables Jesus tells, you've got, the king who goes to receive a kingdom. Okay. Yeah, that's Jesus. No, he's not dying in that story and rising again, but Jesus is the king who goes to receive the kingdom. But in Lord of the Rings, and this is where it took me a while to buy into your thesis here, is because it's like, first of all, you've got Tolkien saying it's not an allegory, and at one point, okay, and then yes, you're right. He says kind of it is an allegory over here, but if this is a Christian allegory or a parable, where's the Christ? Where's Jesus?
Yeah, we'll talk about that. I think one of the things that's really critical here that we understand is that in letter 142 of that collection of letters, that it's the only collection that exists, that I researched. I got permission to do it and stuff from the Tolkien estate. I had to jump through all the hoops, which was great because I wanted to use them. And show people this is what he said. I lost my train of thought, but he basically says, here it is. He said, I have deliberately cut out any explicit references to religious and moral truth or something to that extent that I found. The religious element is absorbed into the story. And so this is very key, I think, in understanding what his friend Robert Murray, the Jesuit friend, wrote in Tolkien and the Art of the Parable, is that it points it even more to it being a parable, is that there is no explicit God talk in most of Jesus's parables. And you have somebody like Bart Ehrman, who I respect as a historian, but disagree with his theology. He says, well, Jesus should have gone around trumpeting that he was God. Well, he did. He just did it parabolically. And avoiding God talk was important. And parable is important in talking about God. So it's like saying you talk about God by not talking about him. God loves indirect speech. And so by Tolkien saying he removed some of those elements that he found, he consciously did this because I think he wanted to keep it more in line with the suggestive, implicit, very elusive and gentle, invitational, supposal-like way that Jesus did, because Jesus wanted people to make a decision about who he was. Who do you say that I am? And I think Tolkien wanted you to discover that too, and to eventually look to find Christ, but you have to participate. And to do that, you'll rob somebody of participation if you say, now, boys and girls, see this lion? This is Jesus. Okay. Do you understand that? If he spelled it out like that, and I'm not saying Lewis does, that's another podcast maybe, but if he had done that, he'd rob the participation, and it would have been like Jesus just kind of, all right, let's just lay the cards out here. You all know who I am. You know what I'm here to do. Yeah. And that would have just been, I think, weird.
Okay. Now, here, this isn't the official challenge pushback question yet. Okay. but I have to know your answer to this.
Okay.
In the story, and I've heard this not just from you, Michael, but I've heard this from others as well. I've heard the reason Jesus told parables, and the reason why parables are so effective, is they communicate something that cannot be communicated without a parable. The parable, the method is the message, or the medium, or the genre. Now, okay.
Yes.
I want to challenge you on that respectfully, because here's why. If the parable itself is the message and it can't be communicated any other way, then why, A, does Jesus explain the parable, for example, the parable of the soils, to his disciples? That's one. And B, why did you write a book explaining this parable?
Yeah.
And if that's the case, that a parable the truth of a parable can't be explained any other way, then aren't you sucking some of the marrow or the meaning out of the parable by writing a 300-page book on the parable? So help us with this.
Yeah, I will. I'll try my best. So
Okay.
I would say, let me work backwards, starting with why I wrote a book, because I mean, fairly, Tolkien even said this himself. Any attempt to interpret a story is going to use allegorical language, and no literature self-interpreting, Joel. So I think it's inevitable that we write books about this. It's inevitable that we extract theology systematically from it, because we want to understand after we've enjoyed the stories, and that's critical. We need to do that first and receive it as a story first. And that's how I did this. I didn't start with this and then read the stories. It was the other way around. So I think, of course, it's maybe unfair to say that it does suck all the marrow out. I know you're just asking the question. I'm not challenging it, but I'm simply saying that I think it's inevitable that one does this because people want to understand what is it about the Lord of the Rings that does communicate that message. And so I had to point it out. And then this leads into the point about Jesus. And by the way, I think it's an excellent challenge and question that you've asked. I don't think that Jesus explained all of his parables. I'd have to go and read them again very carefully, but I think in Mark 4, he does. But then he also deliberately tells them, quoting Isaiah, the prophet, that he is telling parables to deliberately sow miscomprehension or to confuse people, meaning that there's something about the mystery of parables that's really critical to understand. He wasn't doing it to be mean or anything like that.
Yeah. Okay, yes, and that's sort of like part 2 of my question.
Right.
Jesus does sometimes tell parables to the crowds in order to sort of keep them befogged or befuddled.
Yes.
But then he does explain them to his followers.
Yes.
And so how does that factor in? Is Tolkien doing any of that with his parable? Is he intentionally obscuring? Does Tolkien, because Jesus had, and I'm a good Calvinist, I believe Jesus, saved his sheep, called his sheep, and the goats weren't going to get it. And Jesus sometimes made sure the goats wouldn't get it. And that's a whole nother conversation as well.
Yeah.
But but is Tolkien doing something analogous here? Tolkien's obviously not a Calvinist, but is he intentionally obscuring something? And if so, how does that factor into this idea, this concept that a parable is meant to communicate an idea in an irreducible way, in a essential way?
Again, I'll quote Tolkien in his essay on Beowulf. Remember, he was a professor of Anglo-Saxon literature, for those of you who don't know, at Oxford.
Totally, that comes through in his writing too.
Yeah, it does. But he says, look, any attempt to dissect a myth will kill it. But then in his letters, he says, you can't help but dissect a myth, because at the end of the day, if you're in the audience of Jesus and you've got to think about this story in Luke 15 of the prodigal or lost son, however you want to translate it, you've got to kind of say, was that about me? Was that about him? Was that about God? Was that about all of them? Was that about Joe and Bob down the street? Was it about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob? Who was it about? It's yes is the answer, So I think it's kind of just one of these consequences of being human, is that we have to process it. But I think in doing that, and I'm admitting this, it does. I'm optimistic. I don't think it spoils the magic. I think that people will be able to still enjoy the books after dissecting it like this. I wouldn't even use the word dissection. I would say reflecting on it, because we want to understand why and how, and inevitably it's what we must do. But back to the point about the genre is the content. N.T. Wright has said this several times in his books, and I think it's very important. And I think that's why we need to receive it first as a myth. Lewis says in his Myth Became Fact essay, you must receive the myth concretely, because myth is a concrete experience. We have to get into the story. And any attempt to make sense of it is going to allegorize it, and we're kind of doomed to do it. But at the very best, when you hear the story, you are encountering the Son of God. You're experiencing an encounter with Jesus. And rather than Jesus just go around trumpeting his identity, he referred to himself obliquely. He wasn't self-referential. But no doubt about it, I think these parables are ultimately, but not exclusively, about him. And I think we still need to come back to the idea that, that the parable is the message, but that we're doomed when we go to interpret it to, maybe overinterpret it. And so we have to be careful. And I try to steer my readers in the book about ways you can do this. And I'm confident that some people will figure it out. Maybe it's a book for people who have already wondered, like I have, and read the books and then want to know why it has affected them so. But there it is. I mean, that's the best I can do. But I think those are some great things for further conversation. There is one last thing I wanted to say on it, and this will be a segue, if I could, into some other things. We need to understand, a lot of scholars interpret metaphor as substitutionary. That is, the substitutionary definition of metaphor is that it's this for that, and it's one way of just saying something literal. That's not what a metaphor is. A metaphor should be properly understood. By the way, I think that definition has materialistic assumptions. This is all there is. And so it's really just another way of saying something in this real world. A metaphor properly understood, I've learned, is saying one thing in terms that is suggestive of another. Okay. And this is different from the allegorical mode we'll talk about. But now if we understand that properly, there's mystery there. Okay. Jesus, many scholars have said, is a giant metaphor, the incarnation. What is stranger than the wedding of God and man? And I'm speaking metaphorically here, obviously. What is stranger than God becoming a man? And yet what was also something in plain sight if you know how to read the scriptures. And it's this wonderful revelation. But when we consider that the incarnation is the greatest metaphor, consider that Jesus is God's parable, and that the God's parable came speaking in parables because God speaks in a way that is accommodated to us to get across who he is. And he knows that we won't be able to understand and think like he does because we're not God. There's a sharp distinction. And so I think that he knew this and spoke in parables for that reason, to disclose who he was.
Yeah.
So.
No, that's, I got to say, I appreciate the way that you explain that. And right now I'm the closest I've ever been to being convinced of that point. If I could say that.
That's great. Yeah. I'm happy to share.
Well, it's a little bit like this. Okay. Let's say I'm watching a TV show, one of these binge-worthy, streaming shows. Okay. And I'll leave it to your imagination as to which one. And I there will be times when I will get to a point in a show where a lot of these shows start out nice and then they get progressively darker. And there are some shows where they're so dark that I can't see any light or benefit in them anymore. So I will make the decision I'm not going to watch this show anymore. But then what happens is I'm engaged, I'm invested in these characters. So I have to know what happens. So I will sometimes look up on Wikipedia or IMDb, and I will look up the plot to find out what's happening 5 or 6 episodes later and what result and what the resolution is to that particular storyline. And I have to say it's interesting because while it will satisfy my curiosity, there is no comparison between reading a Wikipedia article about the plot and experiencing the story before my eyes or as it were, on the page. Exactly. And so just a quick comment here from Miguel Benitez Jr. watching on YouTube. He says, perhaps a distinction can be made between talking about the message and the message itself. This would allow one to talk about the parable, even preach on the parable without claiming to be equal.
Yes.
So do you like his explanation there?
I do. I think Miguel's a friend, and thank you, Miguel. Yeah, I think that's right. And there's no substitution for, and you're saying this too, experiencing the myth concretely. When you start to talk about it, you're going to spoil some of the enchantment, but we inevitably have to. But the best experience, if we're comparing the two, using your excellent example too, is just to experience the story, rather than look it up or read my book, So I think I should say, I don't think that we've dissected anything here. I think we've reflected. This is my meditation on my journey, and it's my meditation on how this book has affected me after I've read it for years and years and years. And I think that's the best time to read a book like mine. But I think if you are mature spiritually enough, and if you can, if you just have a leap of faith, I hate to use that phrase here, I'm using it incorrectly, but just to read the book and then read Tolkien's books, I still think you'll benefit, because I guarantee you will not fathom all all that Lord of the Rings has to offer, even after reading my book. I have barely scratched the surface. So I'm confident. I'm optimistic on that. I know we want to move on to other things, but yeah, that was awesome. Great comment and great example from both of you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Okay. So there is one more. This is a little bit of a side trail. So maybe we can address it quick, and you tell me if we can't address it quick, because there's some other things we need to get to, but there's one point I want some clarification on. So on page 217 of your book, you make this comment. So it's a brief comment, and you say that after the Lord of the Rings saga has completed, and this is in between the end of the Return of the King and now moving toward the unfinished work, The New Shadow. You say, because it seems a little counterintuitive, the fact that there's been a resolution to the story, but then there's a new work called The New Shadow. And a lot of people don't even know that there was a book called, or an unfinished work called The New Shadow. I didn't know that until I read your book. But the persistence of evil, the fact that evil hasn't been done away with, makes one question just how Christian this work could be. Now, here's my question for you. You said that the persistence of evil, quote, does not at all prove the absence of the incarnation in the Lord of the Rings. In fact, all this evidence only points more to the presence of the incarnation and goes to show how deeply Christian Tolkien's mythology really is, end quote. Can you unpack that idea for us here just for a minute?
Sure. So just real quick, The New Shadow is in volume 12. I'm just looking on my bookshelf. The History of Middle-earth series, edited by Chris Tolkien. It's The Peoples of Middle-earth. It's an unfinished sequel he wrote. It's set 100 years after the Return of the King and Aragorn's death. I say death because Tolkien never refers to it, that he dies. And it's people are bored with peace. They're sick and tired of hearing about the War of the Ring. They're sick and tired of Frodo. They're sick and tired of hearing about all that. They're playing orc games and they're into cults. And I say, look, this is life as we know it. Look at what's going on with wokeism right now, right? And we have a lot of cults out there, and we have a lot of orc games, as Tolkien kind of puts it. And I think this is just a description of the way the world is sitting between the already and not yet Christian story. So that's what I mean here. And I want to quote Timothy Keller, because his proverb devotional I wake up with every day. And I read this, and I've read it, and I've read it again and again. And it has helped me to understand why the Lord of the Rings is enduringly sad. And he says this: there is a tragedy and a sadness to life from which no amount of celebration or rejoicing can provide a full escape. Some wounds never really heal. Now that's Keller drawing on Middle-earth anyway, because he loves the books. The festal joy that Jesus brings is always partial in this life, never full. This is God's wisdom for everyday life. It's a Proverbs devotional wisdom literature. This is what I'm getting at. Many Tolkien scholars have said, the Lord of the Rings is sad. I'll tell you why it's sad. It's because there's no Jesus. If Jesus was in there, everything would be happy. And I'm thinking, really? We can do better than that. Okay, yes, things are happy, but we're not whistling in the dark here. But we are still suffering. There is still the persistence of evil. And so I think it's a very good Christian theological response to say Tolkien was just characterizing the world as we know it between those two moments. And this is good theology. I don't think it's evidence that there's no incarnation. I just think it's that we've misunderstood how Jesus is present in Middle-earth, which is parabolically. And so I think Tolkien scholars have just gone in the wrong direction. They've said it's sad because Jesus isn't in there, but that's a misunderstanding of what our faith teaches, I think.
Okay, so I get how it's not, I believe I understand how it's not evidence for no incarnation, but how is the persistence of evil in Arda or Middle-earth evidence for the incarnation? Can you, now I understand it's corresponded, but not simply metaphorical, but in what way does that show that, that there is the theme of incarnation in the Middle-earth?
Now, this is going to take us down a biblical rabbit hole, but my interpretation, which I really don't want to get into it too much, but John Walton's interpretation of the Genesis story, even Mike Heiser's, they're kind of different. But and then 1 Corinthians 15, Paul, talking about Jesus has to keep on reigning until death is put under his feet and all enemies. And the last enemy to be defeated is death. I guess I should have worded this better. I don't mean that the evil is proof. I just mean that this is evidence that it's a reflection of the way the world really is, even after the advent of Christ, is that even though we have this hope, and I'm suggesting that in Middle Earth, we have the hope through the return of the king. And that's the same in our world, is that the king has returned. He is setting things right. And there's some really wonderful stuff at the end of the return of the king that drives us home. Aragorn is coronated. He gets married to Arwen. He discovers a tree sapling that used to be in heaven, Tolkien's version of heaven, which was on earth once upon a time, like Eden, the mountain and garden of God. So if you put all these things together, I think it's very clear that the return of the king means God is present and he is sitting enthroned, but he has to keep on reigning, as Paul says. So I think the evil doesn't show that, God is real, or that it maybe I worded it wrong, but I think, does that make more sense?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. No, that makes a lot of sense. That verse that you brought in about Jesus reigning until all the enemies are placed under his feet, that is the reality in which we live today.
Precisely.
And look around, there's plenty of evil, there's plenty of suffering, and yet there's hope in the midst of that suffering.
Exactly.
And are you saying that's what's going on in Middle Earth after that saga?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
No, that's super helpful. Thanks for explaining that.
Oh, my pleasure.
Okay, so right now, I'd like to move into some of the tough questions. One is coming. We've got a lot of comments on the on YouTube and Facebook coming in.
Awesome.
We've also got there's this article from gotquestions.org, and I actually had Shane, who runs Got Questions, on the podcast, I don't know, several months ago. It was a great conversation, but he has an article, and I don't know if he wrote it or somebody else, but he has an article that expressly says Lord of the Rings is not a Christian story for a lot of the reasons why we've that you've already addressed. Well, there's no, it's lacking certain elements. I think he's looking more for like a Chronicles of Narnia kind of allegory, but there is one point from his article that I wanted to bring up.
Sure.
Okay. And that's this. For a story, this is the point that they make on Got Questions. For a story to be truly Christian, there ought to be some kind of redemption where an evil character, sinful character, is converted, changed, born again, regenerated, and becomes good. And you don't see that. This is the point they're making. You don't see that in Lord of the Rings. There isn't, Sauron doesn't see the error of his ways and, return. So what do you think? Did Tolkien miss something here? Could he have made his story more, and I won't tell Tolkien you said this, okay, whatever your answer is. What do you think about that?
Well, to answer this question, I read the article pretty thoroughly today, and I've heard it before in many books by other authors on Tolkien and his books. The first thing we have to understand is that this is based on a misunderstanding of not theology, but just about what kind of literature this is, I think, and how language works.
Okay.
So remember, we talked about the spectrum of allegory, and I reduced it to the conscious and intentional that he disliked, and the fairy story / parable on the other side. Okay, well, let's talk about these opposite ends of the spectrum. Okay, so what is it about the one that Tolkien disliked that everybody always says it's not that kind? Okay, well, the conscious and intentional allegory, although he doesn't say this, other scholars who have written about it have, has the allegorical mode. Now, I'm not talking about the genre. Okay, we know the genre already. We're working within the genre of allegories. Allegorical mode is the way language is used in context, and allegorical mode is actually not indirect language. Some scholars have argued it's more direct. It's very transparent. C.S. Lewis puts it, he says, the light is sharp and clear. It does not fall through stained glass. That's a great way to put it. It's you know exactly what you're getting here. It's one for one. And it's dominated by this mode, so much so that the entire composition is like this. And in his essay on Beowulf, Tolkien says, look, just because you have allegorical mode present in an allegory or in a story of any kind doesn't mean that the whole thing will be allegorical. So that's something else we need to keep in mind when we talk about the other end of the spectrum. But the reason why he didn't like that one is because it is dominated so much by the allegorical mode that you start going through parallel mania, as one biblical scholar has called it. And, Aragorn is Jesus, and you start to see equations and you start making them.
Right.
And that's not, of course, what's going on here.
Okay.
On the other end, the fairy story / parable, and I regret that we won't have time to connect those two, but I talk about in my book how Tolkien's description of fairy story is analogous to or close, using research from his own friend, to parables. But on this end, you have less allegorical mode. It is a type of allegory, yes, technically, because it's one thing that speaks of another. That's what all allegory is. And even metaphor to a certain extent, and even parable to a certain extent. Okay, so it's got less allegorical mode. That is, it's less direct, it's less clear, it's more dominated by the metaphorical mode, which we defined earlier properly, not as a substitutionary understanding of metaphor, but metaphor is saying one thing in terms that are suggestive of another. And so we have the parable dominated by a metaphorical mode, where the types in both stories are reminding us of each other suggestively, and the allegorical correspondence between, let's say, types in the Bible and types in Tolkien's books they break down. You're like, okay, well, Thorin really does remind me of King David, but he doesn't. But he also reminds me of Josiah and also Judah Maccabee, and yet none of these people, and it's not the same. And well, there are two kingdoms. One falls first, and then the other one. That reminds me of after Solomon with King Rehoboam and all that. And so you start thinking, but then the correspondences start to break down, and you realize, okay, but it's not about the Bible. Okay, and that's what a good parable does, is at a certain point, the author is so good at telling the story, dominated by a metaphorical mode, which is this is the DNA of what's going on, I think. You're so like trying to make these correspondences, but the author somehow takes it off the table and breaks down, and you're like, well, I thought this was about the Old Testament,
right? But
maybe it's not. Okay, so then on to his understanding. I think if we go into the Lord of the Rings looking for a salvific figure, we're not gonna find him. And I think that it's the same thing. Jesus doesn't come around trumpeting salvation. He prefers to speak of it in parables. Now, there are places in the Gospels, yes, when he's not speaking in parables where he's clear, and that's another conversation for another time. But I think we need to understand that we don't need to have an exact dying and rising Messiah in Middle Earth. And of course, here's the main reason. That would make it the kind of allegory he didn't want. So what I'm suggesting is that he could still have it be about salvation. And I do think that Frodo, in a sense, is saved as he sails off to the Undying Lands. I do think he failed, yes. I think that people were healed by Aragorn's hands, for those of you that don't know. So there is redemption and healing. And anyway, we get in deep to this. So I think there's evidence of salvation, but then we have to get into what does it mean to be saved? And I talk a little bit about that in my book. So we get into that as well. So there's a lot of questions here. What does it mean to be saved? Are we saved to and for something? Or are we saved from? Or is it a combination? And, do we see it in Middle Earth? I think yes. And look at Aragorn going through the paths of the dead. He descends into death. He conquers death. He commands death. And he puts death to work for him. And then he forgives them. And they're free. So I think you have it there. And Aragorn lays down his life. And there's a hint.
Can you repeat that? You said, who's forgiven and set free?
Well, so the men that betrayed Aragorn's ancestor, Isildur, are these.
Lost you. You're frozen right now. Okay, so I'm gonna talk to fill in some of this gap here, but we are on with Michael Jahosky. We're talking about the Lord of the Rings, and we're talking about how there's criticism of the story that not fully Christian because it's lacking certain elements. And Michael is revealing for us, explaining for us how the story, although it seems to be lacking some of these elements, but in reality, they're there. They're just there in a different sort of way, and maybe some of the emphases are a little bit different. So, Michael, if you can, okay. So Michael has just logged out. I think he's, Lord willing, he's going to log back in. Otherwise, you're going to just hear me talking about the Lord of the Rings. But listen, as exciting as that might be, I didn't write the book on it. Michael Jahosky did. So, some other remaining questions that I have for Michael is would be like, when it comes to the worldview of J.R.R. Tolkien and how he oh good, okay, he's back. All right, good. Here we go. He's back.
Hey, you know
Hey,
what?
man.
I did this on purpose to prove that, I died
Yeah,
and then I'm back,
it's
right?
the return of the Jahosky.
It is. Look at
It's the
that.
good news of the return of the author. This is it.
Oh, see,
Brilliant.
that was perfectly timed. So thanks for covering for me. My internet crapped out on me, so
Yeah,
apologies for that,
all
guys.
good. You know what?
So
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
No, please finish the thought, and then I wanna get to a few of these other questions, but please,
Yes.
you
So
stopped mid sentence, so yeah.
yeah, so clearly, the dying and rising of the Messiah is not literal, and if it were, it would be the wrong kind of allegory. So I'm
Mm,
suggesting it's there, but in a parabolic way. That truth about these elements of the Christian story are reflected in a different way, and that's what we would expect from the kind of allegory that the Lord of the Rings is, not the kind that Tolkien disliked. So of
okay.
course, the allegorical correspondences break down, and that's to keep you guessing. And it's also one last thing, metaphorical mode is to expand your knowledge. And at one point in the book, I talk about how this is an extension of the Christian story, and that's what his son said, Tolkien's son. And what he meant by that, I think, is that because sometimes as soon as he reveals a connection to the biblical story, he takes it away because he wants to open up your understanding of
Yeah.
what the Christian vision is all about. And so if he made it a one for one, it would tell you a story you already knew.
That
So
is one of the most effective, and if I'm completely honest, one of the most frustrating things about a parable is
yeah,
we want to draw these one-to-one connections. And the
yeah,
immediate example that I think of, Michael, is the parable of the soils. So
yes,
in the parable of the soils, Jesus is talking about the gospel that is sown is like a seed, and it plants in the soil. And it's like, okay, so I got it. So the gospel is the seed, and then the soil is people.
right.
Okay, fine. But then the seed germinates and begins to grow, and then suddenly the seed is not the gospel anymore. The seed
Mhm,
is the Christian, like the baby Christian who's sort of
mhm,
growing and getting ready to bear fruit. And it's like, wait a
mhm.
minute, I thought the seed was words and a message, but now you're telling me it's words and a message don't grow, and now
Right.
you're telling me that it's, so is soil the person? Are we supposed to be good soil, or is this just communicating something that's allegorical, that's parabolic? It's
Mhm.
it's communicative, but it's not a one-to-one simple allegory. And so
Exactly,
that's
exactly.
I'm getting a strong
That's
parable of the seeds, parable of the soils vibe
you're
from
getting it,
your
but
your writing.
you're also understanding the difference in the shift. Okay, what another feature that makes a parable and fairy story great is that
Mhm.
shift between the realms, if you will, and the shift between what I guess I mean to say here for now is the allegorical to the metaphorical mode, to the clear to the suggestive, and
Okay.
that's what makes it such a tantalizing story. So with the parable of the sower, it's all of those things. And Jewish thought has always been at home with paradox and with a both and kind of understanding of that. So I think that's all accurate there. So I know we want to move on, so I'll stop there.
Man, we could talk about this all day. We really
We
could.
could, we could.
Okay. The one question that I've got to ask you. I wanted to ask you about NT Wright.
Yeah,
My
yeah.
my cards on the table. Well, I'm not going to put my cards on the table, but I will.
That's all right.
But I wanted to ask you about Michael Heiser.
Yeah,
And here's
yeah.
why. So I had Dr. Heiser on this program. Incredible conversation. It
Hmm.
continues to be the most watched video uh, that we've done. Fantastic discussion. I endorse his work. I think it's fantastic. But here's the question I wanted to ask you. You start out the book talking, I think, very, very well, explaining very clearly how everything you just said is true.
Hmm.
The story that Tolkien is weaving is not a one-to-one simplistic metaphor. Okay.
Hmm.
So there's going to be elements scattered throughout the story from the Bible into Middle Earth.
Hmm.
But then when you get to talking about Iluvatar,
Hmm.
did I pronounce that correct?
You did. Yep.
Iluvatar,
Hmm.
who is sort of the stand-in for Yahweh.
Yes,
And you
exactly.
start to talk about his divine counsel. At
Yes.
this point, now I recognize, and you made it explicit, but even if you hadn't, I would have recognized the
Cool.
the connections to Dr. Heiser and his
Hmm.
work. But it seems to me, if I understand you correctly, Michael, you are saying something along the lines of Tolkien subscribed to something like the divine council worldview of Michael Heiser, where you've got Yahweh, but then Yahweh has his, who is, you know, the Lord, the God of the Bible, has his divine counsel, as you call it, his heavenly, or his divine family, his heavenly family, and his earthly family, would be human beings. My question, and I'll just cut to the chase. Doesn't it seems like sometimes, how about this? How are you not reading backward into Tolkien's thought, an idea that didn't arise until 70 years after Tolkien would have written those books? Like, are we really to think that Tolkien subscribed to something like Heiser's work?
No, of course not. But I think that Heiser's work is not new in that sense, in one sense, in that if you take a ancient Israelite point of view and read the scripture properly in its own historical, theological, literary contexts, those concentric circles in which we read scripture, and then there's more we could add to that. I think that anyone who has a knowledge of scripture and is guided by the Holy Spirit would be able to come to those conclusions faithfully. And so I think that Tolkien was aware of that. And I also think this is true because the other explanations for the Ainur, the Valar and the Maiar, these divine council beings in Middle Earth, is insufficient. I don't think it's a reference to the Trinity. It wouldn't make sense anyway. That's one argument. I don't think it's a reference to Jewish elders or human beings in Middle Earth, is what we would say. It doesn't make any sense. They're not archangels and angels, although that's close, I think, because with Heiser's work, what he's pointed out, which has been in plain sight all along, and I think that anybody could have figured it out in the mid-20th century if they opened their Bible and knew certain things like languages and history and theology like Tolkien did. I think he would have come to the conclusion these aren't angels so much necessarily, or archangels, which I think also Catholicism gets wrong. I think that this is the divine council. And Tolkien knew his Bible. He must have known about Psalm 82. He knew Hebrew to a certain extent. I think he worked translating the book of Jonah. So he was familiar with that and creating the story and the language of the dwarves, who he thought of like the Jews, he says explicitly in his letters. So I think it's interesting. I think on one sense, Heiser's work is not new, and so Tolkien could have known about it for the reasons that I've stated. But the other thing I would say is how I break into the more clear one-for-one correspondences. I know those were the other part of the question. Well, of course I do this because my whole argument is that a parable shifts between the modes. There are going to be points in the story where the exile and return types are very clear and parts where they're not. There's going to be the two kingdoms, one falls and is sacked. We think of Assyria. We see that in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and Silmarillion, but it's not the same. So it goes back and forth. And I think the Silmarillion is really clear on the cosmogony, the creation myth of the Bible. It's very parallel to that. I wouldn't say derivative. And the divine council stuff, I think it fits. And Louis Marcos, has already written a review of Heiser's book integrating this, and I think other scholars are picking up on it.
That's so. He connects Tolkien with Heiser.
Yeah, so Louis Marcos wrote a review of The Unseen Realm, one of Heiser's books, which is one of my favorites. That's the big one. Yeah, it's a real big book. I did a Bible study on that with some folks. It took a long time. So the point I was making is that in his review of that book, he mentions the Silmarillion, and he picks up on some of the stuff. And he's also been on that podcast with Heiser, like I have been, where he's talked about, among other things, Milton, Paradise Lost, and other things. But he's talked about the Unseen Realm and Tolkien sort of stuff. So I wonder what I haven't listened to him yet. I wonder what he's said about this. But again, the allegorical correspondences, Iluvatar, Yahweh, Divine Council, the Valar and Maiar, I think those are the clearer connections. But then Tolkien takes those away and there are less clear connections. Okay. So it goes back and forth.
So that is very helpful.
Good.
Because that was one of the questions that I had was at the beginning of the book, you're saying, look, it's a parable. We shouldn't expect one-to-one. But then you're talking about the Iluvatar, the Valar, and it's like, well, that sounds a lot like, is Jahosky, contradicting himself or what's going on? But no, that's incredibly helpful. So thank you.
Good. My pleasure.
Okay, good. Again, we could talk about it all day, but I got to get to some of these comments. Are you good to take a few comments?
I'm good. Yeah, absolutely. Let's go.
Okay. Here we go. Let me, okay. Now this one's coming from earlier. This is from that earlier Facebook thread. And I don't know if he's watching right now, but this is from, it's blocking our faces. If you're watching on the video, this is a slight reprieve from, from having there we go. So Andy Kumar writes this. Now he was talking about. He said that I asked the question is, and this was total clickbait, and some people recognized it, but I said, is Lord of the Rings Christian? And Andy Kumar said it's allegorical, but it's not Christian. Here's what he says. And I said, okay, what is it allegorical for? And he says, I withdraw my statement that it is allegorical because of this. Quote, this is a quote from Tolkien, as for any inner meaning or, quote, message, end quote, it has in the intention of the author none. It is neither allegorical nor topical. I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations and always have done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. J.R.R. Tolkien. And this is in the foreword to the second edition of The Lord of the Rings. I know you know about this. You addressed it often.
Yeah.
But now what Andy Kumar continues on, he says this. He says that he stands by his statement that it is not Christian, but he withdraws his statement that it is allegorical. He says it's more Catholic, which is heretical. So I'm going to just drop this Easter egg on you and let you respond.
Okay, so I started to on Facebook to him as an excellent point, but you have, as I told him, you have to take this in like we take scripture with scripture, analogous to that. We have to take Tolkien with Tolkien. He contradicts himself in many other places, although he really isn't. We think that he is, but he's using allegorical. He's sometimes using allegory as a mode. Sometimes he's referring to allegory as a composition. Sometimes he's referring to one type of allegory and not to another because of the ways in which, in the context in which he speaks about this subject. So here what he's saying, I think, is that it's not just about the Bible. It's about what the Bible is about. It's about reality itself. It is mysterious. The Christian story still has much to teach us. There's so much to learn here. You can come back to this world again and again. And it also has, and I address this in my book, other religious influences because Christianity is the myth made fact. There are other religions Tolkien wants to show Christianity is fulfilling. So I think that's another important element to take in here. That's the reason why people correctly point out there are other religious and philosophical influences or mythological influence because they're there. And they're there deliberately to show that it's more Christian, to show that is the true myth. So let me set that aside and address the rest of it. What he's saying is it's not just about, one-for-one correspondences. And here I think he's taking issue with the conscious and intentional allegory as an overall composition where all of its parts are dominated by the allegorical mode, and all of what you read here in The Lord of the Rings is just a sermon of what's already in the Bible. That's what he's taking issue of.
Right.
Or that it's about World War II or about both. It's about these things and more, and it's also not about these things. It's the yes and no. It's the parabolic way and the indirect, maddeningly indirect way, circuitous way of talking about the biblical vision. So there, I think there's no contradiction, but it's a good one. Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you for that. We've got another comment now. Let's see. This is from, here we go. Oh, this is just a comment from Alicio Trejo. He says, some of these comments are going back to the beginning of our conversation, but he says, there's definitely a touch of Ezekiel and the dry bones with Aragorn in the cave. Do you see that?
That's a good one. Yeah, I didn't see that. He's right. He says, "Son of man, speak these bones to come to life," something to that extent in Ezekiel. And that's exactly what Aragorn does. He commands their allegiance and they work for him, and then he forgives them. He redeems them, maybe, but not in a strict allegorical sense. He's setting them free from their oath that they broke long ago. And yeah, I think he's right. I wish he had told me that, man, like 6 months ago. That's okay. Yeah, I'm kidding, of course. Yeah, that's a good one.
There's always, now you got your sequel.
Yep.
Okay.
So, good one. Yep.
Yeah, no, very, very good. Joel, by the way, Joel Donahue, great first name. Give your compliments to my parents. Are there any biblical themes in the Silmarillion?
Oh yeah. There's so many. I mean, the way I say in chapter 5, and keep in mind, I take a retrospective journey from the unfinished sequel of The Lord of the Rings all the way back from the Return of the King. And we look back like Jesus invites us to do with scripture from Luke 24, all the way back to the Silmarillion. And once we get there, we see themes of creation and fall dominate There's a story about the elves in the Silmarillion, and again, it's not a one-for-one at all. It is so not a one-for-one. But there's a kinslaying where one tribe of elves kills another. One is going to think of Cain and Abel.
Sure.
But you're going to also think of several other examples of violence in the Bible and in kinslaying just in general, in Greek tragedy, for example.
Absalom and Amnon. I mean, it's all throughout.
There you go. Exactly. But that's just a good one to bring up there. You have, the two trees in Eden. You have two trees in Valinor. Valinor is like the heaven on earth in Tolkien's universe, which the earth was flat originally. And then Iluvatar, after I think he sinks Numenor later in the Second Age or the end of the First Age, I'd have to double check my chronology. The world becomes spherical and Valinor disappears, just like Eden kind of has receded from view. So there's so much. The creation myth is probably the dead ringer. I mean, God is singing. And we think of the book of Job, the morning stars sang when God created the world. And so we could go on and on. Yeah. There's a lot. Read chapter 5 of my book for sure.
Yeah. Endorsed, definitely. So Dr. Strange on YouTube.
What?
He says this. Yeah. He says, Lord of the Rings has a pantheon of gods, including Sauron, and Gandalf is a semi-divine figure. Now, this is not so much a question. Now, this actually, first, okay, so please respond to that. But then also, does this tie into what you were saying earlier about the divine council? Could Tolkien have been drawing not so much on scripture, but on some of these, any polytheistic religion, the Norse pantheon or the Roman pantheon? Could he have been drawing more on that? And in the Valar, could we be seeing more of a council of gods? I mean, I know you're blurring the lines here, right? Because some of those gods are the divine council, but what are your thoughts?
I think that the biblical story, Lewis pointed out a long time ago in, I think his Theology Poetry, one of his essays about we should expect to find in the minds of pagan myth makers and poets glimpses of that theme of the story of reality, right? And so I think Tolkien is definitely drawing on pagan mythology. And yes, he's right. These are all divine figures. Dr. Strange, I love your name, by the way, is right on the nose. But do I think he's drawing more on that? No, I think he's showing how those are not incompatible with the henotheistic, which is still strictly monotheistic vision of the Bible, which is that there is no perfect being except God. God is God, but he has other divine beings that are in possession of free will and are less than perfect and can fall and that are spiritual beings that are part of the divine council and yet they're divine beings. And so that corresponds with Heiser's research. And Gandalf is a divine being when he's fighting the Balrog in Moria, spoiler alert. He's fighting his rival on the divine council, but they're junior figures, just FYI. Sauron is also a junior Maiar. That's why in the Hobbit films, a really cool scene when Gandalf, I think this is in the extended edition, is fighting this light and shadow battle with Sauron. It's two equals going at it on the divine council. And we think of the scene from Job with God calling the divine council and, we get fireworks here. So yes, whereas the first Dark Lord is a senior.
That's
deity.
Melkor?
That's right. Or Morgoth, as the elves call him. And it's basically just bad guy, dark foe of the world. Yeah.
That's Satan, essentially, correct?
No, yeah, basically, I think it is. I think, you have to read Heiser's Demons book where he gets really into demonology for more, but more or less, he is the big bad guy. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. All right. Very helpful. All right. Let's see. We got a lot of comments. We can't get to all of them.
Great.
But,
I'm glad to hear it though.
Yeah, but listen, if you're watching this on Facebook, read the comments. Alicio Trejo is he's going hard here with a lot of some good theological comments. But let's take one from Nate Werner.
Awesome.
He says, Nate likes to tread that line between insightful commentator and troll a little bit. He's on the insightful side. Okay, he's on the right side of history here. But he says, Nate Werner says, question: who's your favorite LOTR character and why is it Gimli?
Yes, it's Gimli. So Yeah, no, it's Aragorn, but I love Gimli because I love Thorin, and I love the connection. You know, Gimli's father, Gloin, was part of Thorin Oakenshield and the Hobbits campaign to reclaim the Lonely Mountain, Erebor.
Gimli is a dwarf.
Yeah, he's a
And
dwarf, and he's a badass. Pardon my language, but he really is. He is, and the actor who portrays him in the films is great. But his history and his gravitas, let me be more serious, I think is why I love him. And when the Fellowship is in Moria, he breaks into song, the Song of Durin, about his ancient people's song, and it reminds us of, I think, the biblical prophecies of Return of the King, but that he's not back yet. And so I think it's got a lot of those themes we've been talking about. And I love how he's always got like a pithy saying in the books. There's always some proverb Gimli has, and he kind of spars with Aragorn, and they go back and forth with proverbs. So I love him, and I love the way he phrased this. Of course, yeah, it's good stuff.
Yeah, very cool. Okay,
yeah.
I just started reading The Hobbit with my family.
Yeah,
and so we're still learning who all the characters are, and you know, I mean, I haven't read The Hobbits. I mean, my dad read it to me when I was a kid, nice. And you know, but we're partially inspired by your book. So
thank you.
So we're
fun with that.
Yeah, no, we're having a blast. So Gimli and Balin and Dwalin and all the dwarves, those are fun characters. And you know, my kids are having a hard time figuring out. So Gandalf, who's Gandalf again? Oh, he's the tall wizard. Okay, and who's Bilbo? Bilbo's, he's the one whose house it is. Okay, and he's a Baggins, but he's got a little Took in him, and the Took is the adventure side. Oh, okay.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
that's great. Out of the mouth of babes, we love.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got now. This next comment was actually made by Eliseo Trejo and Joel Donahue. And that is, Michael, when we were talking about repentance and being born again, Eliseo points out that Boromir repented, and Joel points out that Boromir / Faramir both kind of redeem themselves. Do you agree with that?
I would. I am going through my trek a little late this year, reading The Lord of the Rings for obvious reasons. I just finished my book, and I'm kind of getting back into just reading the book now for pleasure. I've got to go look at the Faramir aspect of things, because I forget what he's done to deserve redemption. But yeah, I would agree with Boromir in the books and in the movies, especially. Beautiful scene. And it's very similar in some ways. Again, the details are where it matters. But yeah, I would say Boromir is redeemed. And even in The Hobbit, when Thorin dies, spoiler alert, sorry, you know, he's on his deathbed and he says he goes to the halls of waiting to sit beside his fathers until the world is renewed. He knows the world is going to be renewed. This goes back to a prophecy in a lesser known story called The Debate of Finrod and Andreth, which you'll read about in my book. And so there's some really good stuff. And that gets into purgatory and the various ways we understand it, salvation, redemption. And so you could even cite Thorin, because he doesn't do such a good job. And then before he dies, he does. So you could add a third character to that. So yeah, Boromir, Thorin are clearer to me. I don't remember about Faramir, but I'll take your word for it. Okay. So yeah, amen.
Okay. Nate Werner also points out that Aragorn is the healer king.
Yeah.
And you brought this up as well earlier. Yes. He says he loves how he sneaks into Minas Tirith to heal Faramir and Eowyn. So that's good point.
By the way, yeah, I think Nate's picture there it looks like a sketch from Da Vinci's notebooks. I'd recognize them anywhere. It looks great. I don't know if he can confirm that, but anyway, I was going to
is that true? On that.
Okay. Let us know if it is. Yeah, go on.
Joel Donahue says he's curious about your take about why Gandalf is the one who, quote, dies and is resurrected instead of Aragorn, if Aragorn is the king. Yeah. Any thoughts on that? Now, this does get back to this idea of parable versus metaphor, but how would you explain that?
Absolutely. So in a parable, again, the allegorical correspondences, the degree to which the author wants you to trace them must break down for it to be a good story. And how one does that through storytelling is beyond me. I'm not a good storyteller. That was Tolkien's gift, not mine. So the answer here, though, is that Tolkien looked at the threefold office of Christ, priest, prophet, king, and divided them between Gandalf, the prophet, the king, Aragorn, and the priest, high priest in Hebrews, Frodo. So here, what he's trying to do is keep you on your toes, not so you can say at the end, "Gotcha, I knew what you were doing," but that you get the themes, you get nurtured by this experience with Jesus. But again, you can't trace it exactly. You can't say Aragorn is the one who actually died like Gandalf, because it was Gandalf who did. But then again, as soon as we say that, you have Aragorn descending and going through the paths of the dead, which is one of the most chillingly written and coolest parts of the Return of the King. And so you have that. So yeah, I think that's why Christ is kind of divided across his threefold offices here in Tolkien's books, and I think that was deliberate to kind of keep it elusive and suggestive.
Yeah. You get a lot of the elements, but you can't just go, this person represents Jesus all the way through the entire story.
No, you cannot. Exactly. That's right.
Mm-hmm. So let's see. By the way, Nate Werner does confirm. He says, it is true, Da Vinci was the first person to describe fluid turbulence.
Yes. And circulation of the blood, I believe he was one of the first. I did my master's thesis on Da Vinci and his Virgin of the Rocks. So I dabbled a little bit in Renaissance history, especially for its the Renaissance obsession with classics. So anyway, I spent a lot of time with Da Vinci. Good stuff.
Cool. Very cool. All right. Last question here, also from Nate Werner. He says, piercing question here. He says, do Balrogs have wings?
I don't recall. I have to go look at the history of Middle Earth and the Silmarillion to see if Tolkien gives a description, which I know he does. But angels don't have wings in the Bible. That's cherubim.
Correct.
So it's close, but no cigar. So I'd have to go look. I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that one. But in the movie, they do.
Man, Michael, you were doing so well until that question. It was man, you got a Tolkien question. You just ask Michael Jahosky because he'll tell you. But looks like things are falling apart here in the end.
Yeah, they're falling apart, man. I'm sorry. I'm real sorry, guys.
Bro, listen, this has been really good. There is one question I wanted to ask you, and I honestly, I'm gonna say this. I'm gonna ask you another time. Okay. I want to have you back on. Here's the question I was going to ask you. I'm going to throw this out there. The question I wanted to ask you, and I know theologically you're on a journey right now, and you've talked a little bit about that on this show at the very beginning. We're all on a spiritual journey. I talk about that all the time on this show. But I wanted to ask you, I'm not going to, but I wanted to ask you what you would say the gospel is. And whether we truly see that in Tolkien. I'm not going to ask you that question because we're already over time. But maybe you could come on again, and we could really just focus in on that question, because I truly think, and this is where you're going to have people who still watch this episode and are going to say, no, Lord of the Rings is a Catholic story, Roman Catholic story, but it's not a Christian story. And Michael, I'm one of these people who I love Catholics. I don't have a lot of love for the Catholic version of theology and the gospel.
Understandable.
And I think you and I could have a fruitful discussion about that, but I'm concerned that if we go there, and I'm sorry, I know I'm throwing this out there now, but
you leave the best part for last.
I mean, you gotta leave them wanting more.
Exactly. We'll do this again. Anytime you want me on, I'd be honored. Let's do it.
No, it'd be my honor. I would love to talk because specifically in relation to Tolkien, I think that is going to be a question people are going to walk away from this with is, okay, it's Christian in the sense that Catholicism is Christian, but is Catholicism Christian? Biblical Christianity, Orthodox, and that's going to be the question that a lot of people are going to have. And I know,
you know what we should do, Joel? I think this is great. We should talk about the salvation question as part of a program about Roman Catholicism in the Lord of the Rings, because there are several parts of my book we didn't get to touch on, obviously, that talk about the Catholic elements specifically. And I'd love to talk to you about purgatory, the Catholic and the Protestant, and the new middle way version that Jerry Walls is proposing, and which is pretty powerful stuff.
Interesting. Yeah.
And also Matthew Emerson, I think he's a Protestant who wrote a book about Holy Saturday, about the descent into Hades that Jesus made, and all what the implications of that are, and how this all relates to Tolkien's mythology. Let's do it. And will also, it'll be helpful and fruitful for me just talking to a Christian brother to figure things out. So
Cool.
we need iron sharpens iron. So let's do it.
Absolutely. Proverbs 27:17.
That's it.
All right. Okay. So, for everyone still hanging in there, I got to tell you, this was a fascinating discussion. I mean, there's a reason why it's gone now about an hour and 40 minutes, because this is just fascinating stuff.
Epic.
And I think that each of the topics we covered today, we could have an episode on each and every one of them. Super helpful stuff. Let me just, again, really quick, recommend Michael Jahosky's book. It's called The Good News of the Return of the King. And if you're just now tuning in, if you're on Facebook or YouTube, you're just now tuning in, go back. Once this is posted, go back and watch from the beginning. It's going to be very edifying for you. And I want to recommend that you go and you get his book, and they can get the book on Whiff and Stock. They can get the book on Amazon. I read the Kindle version. It's on Kindle. Which way gives you the most proceeds? Or is there any difference?
All of them are fine. You know, this is a ministry for my wife and I. I wrote this book. I wanted people to know Jesus in an imaginative way. So I don't care. You know what? I didn't get into it to make money. I just want people to read it. Let's talk about it.
Yeah. That's what you want to make money though, right?
Well, I mean, it helps. It'll help my kids. That makes me happy. Look, it's okay. The money part's great, but I mean that. I know it might sound cheesy, but I really do. I don't know how the proceeds things work, and the royalties are a small fraction. So just get the book and let me know what you think, and let's dialogue. And thank you, all of you, for your support, and Joel, most of all, for having me on. I can't tell you how much it means to me. So thank you.
It's my pleasure, man. My pleasure. All right. So everyone, thank you for watching. Can I just encourage you to share this video? Share it on Facebook, Twitter, Parler, MeWe, all the social media. Connect with the Think Institute on all those social media platforms as well. We are coming up big on those insurgent social networks like Parler and MeWe. But if you're other traditionalist networks, the establishment networks like Facebook, Twitter, we're on them as well. We, from time to time, will post a picture onto Instagram as well. You can learn more about partnering with the Think Institute and the Settecase family. Yes, we are support raising missionaries through Cru. We are non-woke missionaries through Cru. And I just put that out there in case anybody has any questions. But you can learn more about that by going to give.cru.org/1018841. Send any inquiries or questions, comments, concerns, or otherwise to thethink.institute@gmail.com. So I certainly hope that you heard something helpful today. I know I certainly did. Very helpful. This is not goodbye. This has just been a little pit stop along the road of your spiritual journey. That's about all we have for you today. So until next time, I hope it made you think.